All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're doing something a bit different. We are completely stripping away the heavy emotional rhetoric and all the intense domestic political debates that usually surround U.S.-Israel relations. Instead, we are looking at this strictly through the clinical, highly pragmatic lens of a high-level Pentagon briefing. We're going to examine the source's breakdown of global power projection purely by the numbers and the geography. To really evaluate this relationship accurately, the source argues that we have to execute a complete paradigm shift. See, the conventional narrative often frames American military aid to Israel as, well, essentially a form of charity. But this geopolitical analysis, it flips that idea completely on its head. From a purely strategic standpoint, it argues Washington actually isn't serving Israeli interests at all. Rather, Israel operates as an absolutely indispensable forward operating asset for American power projection across all of Eurasia. To logically break down the mechanics of this geopolitical alliance, the briefing uses four main pillars. 1. The aircraft carrier. 2. Securing arteries. 3. Hostile superpowers. And 4. The R&D incubator. Okay, let's start with pillar 1, the aircraft carrier as a geopolitical anchor. So here is the overarching metaphor that really guides this entire analysis. In Washington's strategic framework, Israel actually functions as a static aircraft carrier. The source describes it as this unsinkable asset embedded directly inside the world's absolute most critical bottleneck for energy, maritime trade, and intelligence. The U.S. essentially relies on this highly disciplined local military power to hold down the Eurasian continent, keeping things stable without actually requiring a massive, overt American occupation force. Now, think about the primary goal of any global power: preserving access to transit corridors, right? But deploying hundreds of thousands of active U.S. ground troops, building massive permanent bases, and parking carrier strike groups indefinitely in hostile territory? That drains literally trillions of taxpayer dollars and carries an immense political cost in American lives. So instead, the analysis points to what it calls the sovereign stronghold model. By anchoring its security architecture in Israel, Washington basically outsources its regional presence. It gets a highly secure staging ground and massive pre-positioned ammunition stockpiles, all without putting a single American boot on the ground. Moving right along to Pillar 2, securing arteries and maritime routes. We all know the global economy relies entirely on the uninterrupted flow of maritime trade and energy through some incredibly narrow geographic choke points. The briefing outlines how the static aircraft carrier enforces a hard security shield over these exact vectors, like the Suez Canal, for instance. It acts as an active, kinetic deterrent against hostile actors trying to shut those routes down. For you and me, the everyday citizens, this is exactly what prevents catastrophic spikes in gas prices and completely runaway inflation. In this light, the military aid provided is described as a fractional investment compared to what the Pentagon would have to spend deploying its own naval fleets to police that exact same territory. So this brings us to a really crucial concept the analysis calls the intelligence and strategic inversion. I want you to literally imagine the absolute vacuum that would occur in the Levant without this heavily armed ally holding the line. Like seriously, what actually happens if this asset just isn't there? Well, the briefing projects a rapid, catastrophic regional cave-in. A vacuum in the Middle East would almost immediately be filled by regional powers like Iran, running right alongside the aggressive expansion of Russian military infrastructure and Chinese economic colonization through the Belt and Road Initiative. The analysis argues pretty bluntly that if Israel didn't exist, the United States would literally be forced to invent it, just to prevent the entire region from collapsing and permanently destabilizing the Western home front. Which brings us nicely to Pillar 3. Hostile superpowers and the axis of upheaval. Looking at the broader global chessboard, the source notes that the Western alliance is currently facing off against a bloc it formally calls the axis of upheaval. That's Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. Within this fracturing international landscape, the analysis makes it super clear that Israel doesn't just fight in isolation. Instead, it serves as the primary strategic buffer, essentially holding the critical southwestern flank of the Eurasian continent against this exact, highly collaborative bloc. And the tactical breakdown perfectly illustrates how this militarized proxy systematically neutralizes specific threats from these competing powers. Let's look at Iran. They want a land and sea corridor to squeeze Western interests. The counterweight is continuous kinetic strikes on their proxy command networks. Russia wants permanent Mediterranean naval and aerial expansion. The counterweight is a persistent Western-aligned air dominance checkpoint. And for China's attempts at economic colonization, this allied powerhouse essentially provides a massive geopolitical veto over attempts to monopolize transit routes to Europe. You see, This axis of upheaval relies heavily on stretching Western resources to the absolute breaking point. The US and NATO are already heavily focused on deterring threats in Eastern Europe and the Indo-Pacific. They simply cannot afford a total security collapse in the Middle East. By outsourcing the front line, the briefing highlights how this autonomous defensive engine secures the theater on its own budget and with its own citizens. It absorbs that resource strain, neutralizing threats before they ever become global crises. And that allows Washington to preserve its conventional deterrence everywhere else. All right, let's look at the final and maybe most calculated dimension, Pillar 4, the R&D incubator and the future of warfare. The analysis here totally shatters a massive mainstream critique. While critics frequently label foreign military financing as this one-way street of American charity, the source argues the modern reality is fundamentally reciprocal. The U.S. is essentially outsourcing the incredibly dangerous, high-risk development phases of modern cyber, AI, and aerospace warfare. Israel functions as the ultimate real-world testing ground for the Pentagon. Let's actually walk through the mechanics of how this active combat proving ground works. In military engineering, computer simulations, they really only go so far. When the Iron Dome intercepts an active drone swarm, petabytes of real-time radar tracking metrics and algorithmic adjustments flow directly back to the U.S. military. The Pentagon then integrates these combat-tested algorithms right into its own global defense architecture. Bypassing computer simulations like this literally saves the U.S. decades of research and billions of dollars in development costs. And it goes way, way beyond just missiles. Enter Unit 8200, Israel's incredibly elite cyber warfare division. As modern warfare increasingly transitions into the digital domain, the report cites this specific unit as an unmatched global powerhouse for both offensive and defensive operations. The cyber innovations created here, we're talking highly complex zero-day vulnerability exploits, are shared directly with the U.S. National Security Agency, acting as this massive digital radar over Eurasian communications. This entire ecosystem also acts as the absolute vanguard for the algorithmic battlefields of tomorrow. They are pioneering the use of artificial intelligence to coordinate battlefield logistics, process real-time satellite imagery, and identify asymmetric threats instantly. By carefully studying how these AI systems perform under the intense chaotic pressure of live operations, the U.S. military can adopt and scale these systems, completely bypassing those incredibly expensive and dangerous trial-and-error phases. Because, let's face it, developing next-generation warfare carries immense human and financial risk. But this specific strategic alliance, it shifts that risk entirely. When a brand new defense technology fails or requires costly recalibration during early deployments, it is Israeli infrastructure and Israeli budgets that absorb the shock, not the American taxpayer and not the American soldier. By partnering with an autonomous power right on the front lines, the United States is effectively buying direct access to a fully mature, battle-tested R&D network. Which brings us to our final takeaway for this explainer. The source text concludes that for the American military, maintaining absolute technological superiority over its adversaries, and I quote, depends heavily on the innovations forged in the fires of the Levantine theater. When you take a step back and really look at the sheer scale of the outsourced logistics, the neutralized maritime threats, and the petabytes of live combat data flowing straight into the Pentagon, it leaves us with a truly provocative question. So who is really projecting power for whom?